I welcome you to my home. Do come in, have a seat. I have something here to relax you. I think you'll find it quite a treat. If you find me sounding insane, it's just the absolute talking. It's just the
Well, welcome back to another episode of ITAT, where we take a look at current events, usually of a technological nature, that I feel have some kind of long-lasting social impact or ramifications. And then we sit down over a tasty beverage and try and divinate what some of those ramifications might be, not really using a crystal ball or tarot cards, but instead by discussing some of the aspects of whatever the subject matter is that maybe some others haven't bothered to discuss or elaborate on. So this episode is somewhat somber, obviously, because it deals with the tragic death of those aboard the submersible, the Titan. Obviously, all of you are probably already familiar with what's happened in general. That there was a company called Ocean Gate that did tours down to visit the wreck of the Titanic. Now, the thing that prompted this video, I think more than anything else, was what I'm hearing about trying to place blame for the event and everybody coming out of the woodwork to do Monday morning quarterbacking about, that they should have known this or that. And there's a certain element of truth to that, and we'll get into that. But let's start off by taking a moment to remember the crew of the Titan, which is the name of this submersible. I hope that their families and loved ones can take some refuge in the fact that not only was it apparently mercifully fast, the way that they perished, but also that they did so in pursuit of their passions. And that's really all that any of us could ask, I think, whether it be for ourselves or for our loved ones. And the one that touched me the most was Suleiman Dawood, the son of one of the other folks that had gone down. When I say pursuit of their passions, not all of those passions were undersea exploration. Suleiman's passion was something I think that we can more easily identify with, and that is that his desire to go on that trip was to bond with his father on Father's Day. And I think that that's something that all of us can identify with. So let's start this video off, please, by raising a glass to not only the members of the Titan, but also everybody who endeavors to further knowledge through exploration and adventure. And by adventure, that's exactly what we mean. We mean that those who don't seek an easy path or a safe path, that do actually then wander into things that they know are dangerous, as all of these people apparently did. All right, let's get into a bit of what I saw. We'll start off with just some baseline elements of the whole thing, and some of you, forgive me, I'm sure this is things you've seen already, but I'll just go over it briefly. This is what the Titan looked like It has basically a cylindrical center section and then two end bells. Now, one of the things that obviously has been talked about a lot is the incredible amounts of pressure that you wind up getting from seawater as you start to descend. At the depth of the Titanic, you're looking at about 13,000 feet or so. The pressure on the outside is around 6,000 pounds per square inch, and so that's quite a substantial pressure on the outside. Now, the current way that you deal with those types of pressure is by creating a sphere. And spheres obviously deal with pressures much better than any other shape because it can allow the pressures then to build on the structure in a uniform way. Anytime you start to then vary from a sphere, you wind up then changing the dynamics of how those pressures then affect the vessel. So in this case, it looks like what caused the failure was that instead of using a billet center section, in other words, a center section that was a contiguous piece of metal, they decided that they were going to use a carbon fiber wrapped titanium tube. Now, I haven't yet been able to dive into and find out the exact dimensions and interior structures of the center section, and I don't think that that's really all that important at this point. What is important is that the center section being a composite of carbon fiber and titanium allowed for a limited lifespan. In other words, you could only compress it and relax it so many times, and that's common with carbon fiber and any kind of lamination, where under stress, the fibers that it's made out of, sometimes they can be quite strong and remain solid, but you're starting to cause, the flex is causing delamination to occur. And by all accounts, that's what the submersible community had warned them about ahead of time, was, oh, you shouldn't you shouldn't do that. It's very experimental and all that. Well, we do a lot of things that are experimental, and so I think that it's inappropriate to do as much Monday morning quarterbacking as we're doing surrounding that. I think that we do need to take it more just as a failure and look at it more in terms of how the aviation community looks at these types of things. And that is that when you have a structural failure or any other catastrophic failure that involves loss of life, then you wind up turning around and examining every single piece of that. Not only how the physical portion failed, but also some of the social elements that might have been feeding into this. There is a video out there that I was trying to find for this, but it's short. It makes me feel that it was, purposely cropped out of something that was longer. I don't like to take things out of context, but it showed them bolting the door closed. I'll talk in a moment about why that is necessary. But it shows them bolting the door closed, and somebody was trying to make a lot about, oh, they're using standard wrenches. Well, look at that video again very carefully, and what you'll see is that though the bolts are starting with a wrench, that then the very next thing that you see is somebody coming along with another wrench. Well, look closely at that wrench. That's not a normal wrench, that's a torque wrench. So that tells me at least that they were aware that you can't just bolt the thing down willy-nilly. And you see this when you're trying to bolt a cylinder head to a car. That's where it really shows up. If you were to just tighten everything down, from one side to the other, you actually wind up stretching that material, and it affects the seals, and it'll warp the head itself, and it'll fail. It will either fracture, which could happen, or it simply won't seal. Same thing with these bell ends. I'm sure that there was some kind of a bolt pattern, or at least there should have been, right? And so these are the kinds of things that now we start to have to look at now that we've had a failure. Why did it fail? Okay, so you have this carbon wrap section, and when you now have that, you have to have some way to bolt that front flange and the back flange on. Obviously the back flange probably didn't have any kind of a hinge or anything, because you're not trying to use it as a door. But the care has to be taken then to what does tightening that down and opening it up and tightening it down over the periods of time where either you're doing for testing or whether you're doing it for actual deployment of the vessel. But what does that do to the surrounding composite as it stresses this hull? And then when you have these two very solid bell ends made out of titanium, and you have a center area that maybe flexes more, how do the two interact? Because you're talking about well over 1 million pounds of pressure in total on this thing. It's just smashing it every time, and so you wind up having these forces trying to drive it together, and then as it comes back up, everything relaxes. What does that do to the laminates? And so those are the kinds of things that I was very curious about. There was also some speculation that somebody had said that the plexiglass that they had for the window was not actually rated for that depth. I don't know whether it was a budgetary thing, or I'm not going to go into the details of that. But also, it's important that we know, was that the cause of the failure? Where did the thing actually come apart? So you can see more now where this video is going, where the far-reaching ramifications of all of this is how very important it is that we bring up all of the pieces. Now, it's not for the families to have some closure or whatnot. With the, I don't know that there's much in line of remains. It's just an incredible amount of pressure to be released so suddenly. So I wouldn't expect that we're going to find much, if anything, in the line of remains, so sadly there. But the remains of the submersible, very, very important to find out what happened to the vessel. Now, you hear a lot in the news that they're making a great deal about, it was run by a game controller, or that they couldn't get out. And now there's some elements of that actually do hold water. The game control thing, that doesn't bother me. It is just an input device. Would it have been nice if they had taken that form factor, if that was their argument, that they wanted to have something that was familiar to this generation as opposed to previous generations of, maybe used to something different, I don't know. But certainly there would be maybe some argument that they should have re-engineered it using mil-spec components and all of that. But for me, it doesn't really matter. If you can't control the thing, it's fine. You still have a manual panel inside that you can then activate that will send the thing to the surface. And in that way, it really was pretty much like an elevator, as you will find that most of these deep sea submersibles, they actually are quite a bit like an elevator. You go down and you can't really rely on anything that's maneuvering you around on the bottom to be able to get you back up. You have to actually be able to have the thing designed so that without weights, it is positively buoyant, it will pop up. And so then if something goes wrong, as it almost always does, you can then release these weights. Because these are incredible pressures. What you have to understand is that if you are talking about working something hydraulically, Cameron had a failure of a hydraulic system he was using on an arm that was designed to collect some samples. The pressure on the outside, especially in his case, was far greater than the pressure used to move the actuator arm. And so they wound up springing a leak. Something opened up, water got in, and the pressure just started to squirt hydraulic fluid out. So anything that is outside of that pressure sphere, you have to consider that as it's going to fail at some point. And so then you design everything around that. Now, that's why you hear that they were using Bluetooth control. Well, that's because that pressure vessel was designed without any penetrations. If you were to have some kind of a design that involved having a pipe or a wire or something like that go from the outside to the in, oh, that's a disaster. At those types of pressure, if you get any kind of a small leak, that was one of the other things somebody had said that it was kind of amusing to me, that they said, oh, you know, well, what if it was a slow leak? There's no such thing as a slow leak at 3,000 feet down. Any time that water is able to get from the outside to the inside, the pressure is going to transfer through to that, and it's going to look like a pressure washer coming out. At deeper depths, it'll wind up looking like a water cutter, and so it's not going to be something that you're just going to be able to put your hand over and stop. But we were not talking about any kind of a small leak with this. Obviously, we're talking about a catastrophic collapse of the structure. But back to that whole thing about the controllers. That doesn't really bother me, again, because there were enough systems, even a time delay system, so that they didn't have any input over a certain amount of time. The system would then go into failsafe automatically and send them up. Much like they have these systems for train operators, where to make sure that they're not nodding off, every once in a while they have to check in and they have to push a button on the panel to make sure that everybody inside is awake and functioning. This had a similar system. Now let's get into some of the things that were actually disturbing to me. Making a lot of the information that I'm giving you and my speculations based not on my limited knowledge of the marine environment. I do have some knowledge of that. I did one tour in the U.S. Coast Guard, so I am aware of how unforgiving the marine environment can be in general, especially on equipment. But mostly on my experience with other machinery and that type of a thing. And so when I start to look at some of the safety systems that were involved, human factors is one of the most difficult things in a factory environment to design for. People just, they don't want to do things safely. They want to do things in an expedient way. They want to cut corners all the time. And so it's very difficult then to kind of convince them that you do need to then go ahead and spend effort in certain areas and then come up with procedures that make it mandatory, demand it as per that. And one of those disturbing things was it didn't have an EPIRB. Now, an EPIRB is an emergency beacon that is activated when the vessel comes to the surface. So we talked earlier about the bolting of the door closed. Because of the pressures that you're talking about down there, it really is impractical to think that you're ever going to open the door down there. And so once we've dispensed with that idea that you're going to then open it somehow and escape, then you wind up starting to look at, okay, well, what is it for? Now, if you look at Cameron's deep sea vessel, you'll first notice that the hatch was tiny, conically shaped, and a huge, thick hatch. But when it closed, it was closed with these little, lift bolts that that were threaded into place and then cinched down, not terribly tightly, because the hatch itself on his vessel was forming the structure of how it was going to wind up supporting all of the weight. Now, when you look at the design that they have here in the Titan, you'll notice that it's a huge ring. They're not coming in through a tiny hatch. They're coming in through the whole open end of the ship. So now those bolts on the outside become really, really important. And so now it becomes a structural portion of the vessel itself. And again, I'm keenly interested in finding out what part failed. How did this thing come apart? Did it crush from the ends? Did it crush from the middle? Was it from a delamination event, right? We know that the tail cone was found separate. Now, when they say tail cone, I don't know whether that just means the fiberglass piece or some of the other structure that was there. We haven't really seen any true images from the bottom of the Titan's debris field. I'd be interested to see that just from a engineering standpoint, not really any kind of morbid curiosity, but I do want to know how this thing came apart. So the bolt patterns. It was mentioned that one of the bolts was left out. This was somebody from a previous trip had noticed that, and they said it was because it was difficult to reach. I find that very difficult to believe. So there are certain things, certain questions that I want to have answered that even though it might be mathematically unimportant as far as the bell ends are concerned, because it's the pressure that's mostly squeezing this entire thing together. In terms of having the top, the cylindrical section deform, I think that having all of those bolts in place would be incredibly important, I would think. So that, again, is something that I'm keenly interested in seeing. And now we'll kind of close this off a little bit with what I mentioned at the beginning of the video as far as the social aspects of all of this. Again, everybody is lining up to point blame, say I told you so, and all of this. Well, we are in an era where everything is a materials game. We're trying to do things in ways that make outrageous accomplishments possible by making them affordable and repeatable, and maybe using materials that are more readily available, easier to work with. And so I'm sure that all of that factored into their choice to use a composite center section. Hindsight is always 20/20. We can look back on this and go, yeah, that was a mistake. Obviously, it's a mistake. We'd like to know exactly why it was a mistake, but it was obviously a mistake. But I think we do a huge disservice, not only to those who perished in the Titan disaster, but also to those that are going to try bold things in the future and innovation in the future. Is overregulation truly an issue? And yes, I think overregulation could be an issue in the future. We want to make sure that we don't stifle innovation and don't prevent this kind of thing from happening in the future, because you can't. You can't. It's just not in the human spirit to be able to try and stop something like that. Now, that isn't to say that they haven't already done things in which I feel is an admirable way. They do have a way that you can get your submersible certified. Just like the FAA certifies spacecraft, there are ways of going ahead and getting it certified. The FAA also allows for experimental craft. So I think the limiting factor here is maybe you shouldn't be taking tourists down in an experimental craft, but then how do you pay for it? That's one of the things that everybody on that submersible were well aware of, that it was an experimental craft and that they were actually helping fund the next generation of deep sea submersible. So that that also can't be overlooked. So in the end, I think that that's the important takeaway here, is that we try and take a more aviation approach to the whole thing. Don't try and attach blame, but instead do our level best to make sure that their lives weren't wasted. We can't leave that debris on the seafloor. We have to bring it up. We have to examine it, know exactly why it failed. That's how we honor their memory and move forward. So with that said, I thank you for joining me, and if you feel that there's something that you would like to know a little bit more about, I can certainly do a follow-up video to this and offer up maybe some additional information, but I really doubt that I'll put anything out until I get a chance to see the debris field and hear about what their failure analysis was on the whole thing. But these videos are driven by your participation and your comments. So please feel free to leave a comment, and I do read them all. I don't know that I'll interact with all of you on the comments. I certainly do interact with some, but the topics on this channel are driven by the participation by all of you. So with that, thank you for joining us, and see you next time.